Descending into heavy fog above Luxembourg.
The hell is that?
Something goes disastrously wrong on Luxair Flight 9642.
The airplane was impossible to recover.
20 of the 22 people on board are killed.
A lot of people died that day. It was an accident that was hard to understand.
I can't find anything wrong with either engine.
But when investigators analyze unusual sounds from the cockpit,
It's a match?
they hear the pilots do something which should be impossible.
It's not supposed to happen. There's supposed to be things that prevent it from happening.
So it's not as foolproof as we thought.
It's just before 10 in the morning at Luxembourg's International Airport. A layer of fog blankets the runway, preventing planes from landing.
Cargo Lux 778, maintain runway heading until Lutax, then use zone navigation. Luxair 403, enter Dekirch hold, flight level 60. I will vect you later for ILS approach.
Controllers are busy putting planes into a holding pattern while waiting for the fog to clear.
Luxair 4452, enter Dekirch hold, flight level 90. QNH is 1023. Luxair 8362, descend level 80 to enter Dekirch hold. Current RVR is 250.
There are 3 planes circling 16 miles north of the airport at a position known as Dekirch.
In a situation with low visibility, lots of holding, lots of aircraft having different requirements, the level of stress is fairly high. Focus is really important. Got to concentrate on everything that you're doing.
Luxair 9642, enter Dekirch hold, flight level 90.
It will be vectors later for ILS approach on runway 24.
That's all understood, Luxair 9642.
One of the planes being directed to the holding pattern is Luxair Flight 9642. The plane is a Fokker 50 turboprop heading to Luxembourg from Berlin.
The Fokker 50 was a great performing aircraft overall. As a commuter airplane to be flown in Europe, we flew the aircraft day and night in all weather conditions.
There are 19 passengers on the flight. Most are German business officials traveling to Luxembourg. The first officer on this morning's flight is 32-year-old John Arendt.
I'll brief the folks. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Unfortunately, the fog in Luxembourg is so dense that at the moment we cannot land. So we'll have to wait a little bit for an improvement. We will proceed to a holding pattern while we wait for the weather to clear. We'll keep you updated as soon as we have some news.
The captain is 26-year-old Claude Perkes.
And Luxair 9642 is reducing speed to 160.
Roger, 9642.
The crew navigates towards the holding area north of the airport.
What time can we hold till? How much fuel will we need?
550, 700. No, we'll need 850 when we leave the hold.
No, we need fuel to reach till our alternate plus 20 minutes reserve, so we'll still need 600 kilos.
Yes, but I want to keep...
Luxair 9642, descend to 3,000 feet on 1023, turn left heading 130.
Before they reach the holding point, the crew receives instructions to turn towards the airport and begin descent.
Is that for us?
Yes.
Descend to 3,000 feet and say again the heading.
130.
Left heading 130, Luxair 9642. What kind of crap is that?
The new instruction takes the crew by surprise.
If you suddenly get startled that you are now number one and turning left and descending for your approach as number one, this can put you in a situation which would add to your workload.
Let's see RVR now.
I don't know. Should we check with dispatch?
Yes.
RVR is runway visual range. It's the minimum visibility on the runway required by a landing aircraft. For the Luxair Fokker, that distance is 300 meters, or 984 feet.
If the runway visual range is below 300 meters, you are not allowed to start the approach or to land the aircraft.
Dispatch 9642. What's the current RVR?
275.
275 meters. What do we do now?
I don't know.
If they don't have that visibility, they go around and probably get vectored for another approach. Unless the RVR is too low, then they're going to be vectored to the holding pattern at Dekirch.
So, are we holding or is this for an approach?
It's for an approach.
Luxair 90642.
Turn right heading 220, cleared for approach.
Right heading 220 and cleared for approach 9642.
Tell them if at Echo we don't have 300 meters, we'll do a go around and enter the hold.
The pilots come up with a compromise. They'll continue their approach, but if runway visibility doesn't improve, they'll abort and join the holding pattern.
We need 300 meters for the approach.
9642, copied. Continue your approach. I'll keep you advised.
Passengers still believe they're headed for an extended hold.
Speeds 95, 105, 109. Landing altitude?
275 meters.
Set?
The flight is now only 5 miles from the runway, and there's no word that visibility has improved. Captain Pukis makes his decision.
Okay, we'll do a go around. Missed approach.
Ground idle stop off.
Luxair 9642, RVR is 300 meters.
But before the crew can execute a go-around, the controller issues a last-minute update to runway conditions.
9642 continuing approach.
The visibility now meets the Fokker's minimum requirements. The crew's plans have changed again.
Things change rather quickly for a flight crew when they're doing an approach, which requires really precise coordination among the crew members to make sure that everything goes smoothly and that they're stabilized on the approach.
4 miles from the airport, Flight 9642 is at an altitude of 1,500 feet.
Flaps?
We are flaps 10.
9642, you are cleared to land. Wind 180 degrees, 5 knots.
Gear down?
Yeah.
Cleared to land, 9642.
The flight is now 2 minutes from landing in Luxembourg.
The hell is that?
Something has gone wrong with the engines. Now at less than 500 feet, Flight 9642 plummets towards the ground.
The airplane suddenly went into a rapid and uncontrollable descent in a very low altitude, which was impossible to recover.
(9642) Luxembourg. Luxair 9642 Luxembourg. Luxair 9642 Luxembourg, do you read? We have a possible crash of a Fokker F-50 on final approach to runway 27. Please stand by.
The wreckage is located 2 miles east of the airfield. Of the 22 people on board, only 2 survived the crash, including Captain Purkis. This is Luxembourg's deadliest aviation disaster.
Well, this accident is serious because it was loss of life. A lot of people died that day, and it was an accident that was hard to understand.
Investigators will need to examine the wreckage of Flight 9642 to determine why a landing at a modern, well-equipped airport went so terribly wrong.
The tail hits here. The left wing scrapes some trees, and then the plane skids across the road.
The wreckage tells investigators that Flight 9642 hit the ground in a nose-up position.
The initial hypothesis would be that, in fact, they were trying to avoid the ground when the aircraft hit the ground.
Engine failure, wind shear, mechanical issue?
The debris pattern leaves investigators with a few obvious possibilities.
Aircrafts don't crash short of runways. Do they have false indications? Were the engines running? So there are lots of things you have to initially think about.
As they gather wreckage from the accident site, investigators wonder if the controller can provide any insight into the flight's final minutes.
Anything unusual, out of the ordinary?
The whole day was out of the ordinary.
The controller explains that the weather prevented planes from landing, forcing them into a hold.
And that includes Flight 9642.
At first, yes. Luxair 90642 entered Dekirch hold, flight level 90. But before they reached the hold, the weather cleared. Luxair 9642, descend to 3,000 feet on 1023, turn left heading 130.
He also states that because of its position, Flight 9642 was the first plane directed to the airport when the weather began to clear.
They needed 300 meters of visibility to land, which we got at 10:05. So I cleared them to land.
Even though they were heading for the holding pattern, the controller saw an opportunity. They were in an ideal position to the final approach fix and also the Luxembourg airport.
And then?
That was the last we spoke.
No emergency call.
No, nothing.
The controller can't explain why the Fokker ended up hitting the ground 2 miles from the airport.
From air traffic control standpoint, there was nothing in the communication between the aircraft and air traffic to indicate that there was any problem whatsoever with the aircraft at all.
Only Captain Purkis can answer why the Fokker went down short of the runway, but he's been hospitalized and is in a coma. Investigators will need to piece together the final minutes of the flight without him.
With the captain not being available, the objective evidence, the physical evidence, talks to you.
They begin by studying the engine components for any signs of failure.
They look like they're in pretty good shape.
Engines normally hold the aircraft in the air and they fly towards the runway. So I would suggest something happened to the engines that they didn't make it to the runway in the first place.
No fire, no damage to any components. The rotors are fine, fuel lines are intact, intake is clear, pumps and PCUs all check out. I can't find anything wrong with either engine.
The state of the engines is puzzling. If both were in good working order, what could have caused the flight to fall from the sky just short of the runway?
This is where they're turned for the approach.
Investigators use Luxembourg's radar data to recreate Flight 9642's flight path.
7 minutes to impact.
They're at 9,000 feet when they're cleared for the approach. Now, he descends even more steeply and at 7,000 feet per minute.
They're only 4 miles away from the runway. 15 seconds later, they hit the ground. Here's the glide slope.
Whoa.
When investigators compare the plane's descent with the recommended descent, they see that the flight was 300 feet too high throughout the final stages of its approach.
That explains why they were in such a hurry to lose altitude.
300 feet above the glide slope, this is a real problem because you now try to descend the aircraft, slow down the aircraft, and configure everything at the same time, which is nearly impossible.
Why did the pilots allow their plane to get into such a difficult situation?
Not a good idea to be rushing on an approach at all, especially in low RVR. Dangerous, actually.
Heavy fog. Be a hard landing.
The team listens to Flight 9642's cockpit voice recording, or CVR, for clues that can explain the pilot's dangerous predicament.
Okay, they know the weather's going to be an issue. I'll call dispatch.
Dispatch, good morning. 9642.
9642, good morning.
How's the weather at the moment?
RVR is 250 at the moment. If it doesn't get better, you will be diverted to Saarbrücken.
Okay, thank you. Oh no, I will not go to Saarbrücken. I'm with you.
Wind 110, 4 knots, expect ILS approach. Runway 27, transition level 60.
He does not want to divert.
Luxair 90642, enter Dekirch hold, flight level 90.
They're being directed into the holding pattern.
That's all understood, Luxair 9642.
No, we need fuel to reach till our alternate plus 20 minutes reserved, so we'll still need 600 kilos.
Okay, good. They want to make sure there's enough fuel to reach their alternate.
Yes, but I want to keep...
Luxair 9642, descend to 3,000 feet on 1023, turn left heading 130.
And then they're hit with a new plan.
Is that for us? Yes.
The recording reveals that the pilots were surprised by the instruction to begin their approach.
What kind of crap is that?
They were not happy about the change of plans.
The sudden change meant that instead of proceeding to the hold, the pilots quickly initiated a left turn and began a steady descent towards the runway, all while configuring their plane for landing.
So the crew were forced to rush themselves down to the final approach fix.
The rushed approach now becomes the focus of the investigation.
Luxair 90642, turn right heading 220, cleared for approach.
Okay, they're starting their approach.
For a low visibility approach, properly briefed and performed, it's very structured, organized, and standardized. So each pilot knows exactly which task they have to do at which time.
Should we switch the seatbelt sign on? Yes, not a bad idea. Localizer captured. Check.
Missed approach heading.
They're not running a checklist. They're just throwing out random steps.
Over the next few minutes, investigators hear several clear indications that the pilots are improvising this unexpected approach.
You must be fully established, which means gear down, flaps extended, landing checklist completed, speed and altitude all at the correct spot.
Hey, are we at the beacon yet?
You should have it dialed in by now.
I can use the DME instead.
Even basic steps, such as configuring the navigation system, aren't performed.
Flying an aircraft is about a precise following of certain steps at certain times. It's starting on an approach involving all the crew members. It's about detailed planning.
They're skipping steps and improvising the procedures. The change of plans caught them by surprise.
They're racing against the clock.
They started to rush themselves in a quite high workload environment, trying to get the airplane down and doing the approach briefing all at once, which was quite tricky to achieve.
Did the rushed approach result in the pilots being too high as they neared the runway?
They're getting closer and closer to the airport. And at 3.5 miles out, they should be at 2,500 feet, but they're at 3,000 instead.
Flaps?
We are flaps 10.
9642, you are clear to land.
Instead of managing their altitude and speed, they're rushing to get their plane properly configured.
Speed and altitude control is actually important for every approach, but especially for a low visibility approach, where you have to be established much earlier than on a normal approach.
So why all the confusion? It can't just be the last-minute approach.
I don't think they thought they'd be able to land. Have a look.
RVR, RVR, RVR.
The cockpit recording makes it clear to investigators that the crew didn't think they'd have the required visibility to make the landing.
Let's see RVR now.
I don't know. Should we check with dispatch?
Yes.
They're told they have a visual range of 275 meters, but they need 300 minimum to land.
I'm not sure how to proceed.
Tell them if at Echo we don't have 300 meters, we'll do a go-around and enter the hold.
Their plan is to do a go-around if the visibility hasn't increased by the time they get to the outer marker here.
The outer marker can be seen as a decision or a cut-off point. Once you pass the outer marker, the RVR must be at the required minimum.
But as soon as they get to the outer marker, they get the magic words.
300 meters.
Luxair 9642, RVR is 300 meters. You are clear to land. Wind 180 degrees, 5 knots.
But they're too high and need to lose altitude fast.
The CVR explains why the pilots ended up above their target altitude. They were rushed into the approach and fixated on the poor runway visibility.
Okay. So how does that lead to a crash 35 seconds later?
9642, you are clear to land.
Gear down? Yeah. Cleared to land, 9642. And done. What the hell is that? Oh. Terrain.
What just happened?
In the last few seconds of the CVR recording, there was a loud noise. Crew was startled by this.
What happened in those last 20 seconds?
And what was that noise we heard?
What the hell is that?
Investigators hope the Flight Data Recorder, or FDR, can solve the mystery of what went wrong in Flight 9642's final seconds.
Okay, cruising along at 3,000 feet and 160 knots. Then they start to descend, go flaps 10, and accelerate rapidly towards the ground.
Let's see what the engines were doing.
What's happening here? Turbine RPMs drop. The torque drops down to 0. Looks like he's gone down below flight idle into ground mode.
Ground mode changes the angle of the propellers so they can move the plane forward while it's on the ground. It's never used in the air.
But then, turbine RPM spikes, fuel flow and torque increase.
All while the altitude starts to plunge.
Could they have gone into beta mode?
Beta mode is basically reverse thrust. The propellers are positioned to move air forward instead of back. It's used to help stop the plane after it touches down.
If you would put the power levers into beta mode in the air, this could lead to loss of control where recovery might not be possible.
Did the pilots of Flight 9642 put their engines into reverse? And if so, why?
Can we hear the last 20 seconds of that CVR again?
And done.
It's the propellers going into reverse.
Investigators now have an explanation for the deafening sound on the CVR.
This is almost like hitting the brakes. The aircraft would immediately dive into a rapid and uncontrollable descent.
How could the engines end up going into ground mode and then into reverse in beta mode? How's that even possible?
The turboprop airplane, like the F-50, it had a lot of safety features that would prevent the propeller from going into beta range in flight.
Before a plane can be put into reverse mode, the thrust levers must first pass through ground mode. A lock prevents this from happening. Pilots can switch the lock off in flight to prepare for landing.
Ground idle stop off.
First Officer Arendt performed that step as part of his descent and approach checklist. With the lock disabled, pilots can lift the ground range selector and move the thrust levers to ground mode after landing to help slow the plane. But instead, the data reveals that the engines went into ground mode 25 seconds before the plane crashed.
And they do it on purpose?
The question is, how did they get there? Did the crew select it? Did they do it deliberately? Was it something bad that happened? The safety defenses didn't work? These are all things that have to be looked at.
Okay, we're recording. Let's start with the taxi lights.
To find out if the crew intentionally put the plane into ground mode before they were on the ground, they record a number of different sounds in the cockpit of another Fokker 50.
Every switch has a sound attached to it.
Okay, let's try flaps to 10. And now the ground range selector. And that does it.
And this can be forensically analyzed and filtered out.
Do you compare that to what you find from the cockpit voice recorder?
These three sounds were picked up on the CVR. Let's start with this. We were able to confirm that this sound is the taxi lights being switched on. Test recording confirms that's the flap handle being moved to flaps 10 position. Then there's this. We compared it to the sound recorded on the test plane.
It's a match?
The audio analysis confirms that Captain Pukes deliberately lifted the ground range selector and moved his throttle to ground mode while the plane was making its approach to the airport.
The key element found in the sound spectrum study was the power lever was in fact moved below the flight idle gate. And this was something that meant the pilot had to do it.
Okay. So we know he did this on purpose. Why?
There is no maneuver or procedure asking the pilots to actually lift the ground range selector in flight and pull the power levers below flight idle. It's a prohibited non-standard procedure and should never be done by the pilots.
What could have prompted the pilots to put their engines into ground mode?
He's 5 miles away from the airport when he decides to land, but he's 300 feet above the glide slope, and his speed is 165 knots. If he wants to get down to the glide slope, he needs to descend rapidly, but his speed is already quite fast. So instead, he slams on the brakes.
Once the power levers are in ground idle, this will produce extra drag on the propellers, reducing the speed and also allowing the aircraft to descend at the same time.
Luxair 9642. RVR is 300 meters.
Investigators believe that when the crew is told that runway visibility has improved, Captain Pukas moved his engines to ground mode to quickly reduce speed and lose altitude.
Not sure that'll do it. 9642, continuing approach. Flaps?
They should have made a better decision and go around, reposition and fly a proper approach or divert to the alternate and not forcing it in.
Okay, we can explain putting the engines into ground mode. But reverse?
The hell is that?
Oh. So the lock is only released when the plane is on the ground.
Investigators know the pilots of Luxair Flight 9642 put their plane into ground mode before landing. But it doesn't explain why the throttles were moved further back to reverse while they were still hundreds of feet in the air.
Should be impossible to do.
To get to that range in flight, it's not supposed to happen. There's supposed to be two things that prevent it from happening.
An electrical lock prevents the power levers from being moved into reverse in flight. Once the plane is on the ground and the wheels are spinning at least 20 miles an hour, a signal is sent to an electrical switch that releases the flight idle stop and allows the throttles to move to the reverse position.
This system is only meant to be used on the ground, and that's why they have a lot of protections to make that only the possibility that's going to happen.
Could the lock have somehow failed?
The mechanical stop is installed so that the pilots can, under no circumstances, physically move the power levers beyond ground idle. So no reverse thrust possible.
Investigators study the components that make up the locking system.
The anti-skid system checks out. The wheel speed relays are fine, and there's nothing wrong with the lock switch.
Investigators also check the anti-skid sensors which measure wheel speed, the computer that receives those signals, and the switch controlling the lock.
Everything seemed to check out normally.
It shouldn't unlock unless the wheels are spinning. So what went wrong?
Investigators scrutinize the electrical lock system that should have prevented Flight 9642 from going into reverse.
Anything in the maintenance record?
There's this.
They discover an incident that happened 14 years earlier.
Power lever setting below flight idle possible in flight. Huh.
In 1988, the flight idle stop disengaged inadvertently on another Fokker 50.
So it's not as foolproof as we thought.
The system design was actually well designed by Fokker, but they knew the system had a problem.
When the landing gear is lowered, an electrical pulse could be sent to activate the plane's anti-skid control unit. That sends out a false indication that the plane is on the ground, just enough to unlock the flight idle stop.
This particular pulse in the anti-skid control unit could in fact allow the power levers to go back into the beta range.
At the time, Fokker said the chance of an inadvertent unlocking due to the glitch was extremely unlikely.
These three conditions must be met for the stop to unlock. Gear down, the left and right gear locks releasing at precisely the same instant, and the power levers below flight idle.
A lot of components had to line up in very great precision to make it happen. The perfect storm of bad things happening together.
Could they have triggered the glitch?
Investigators returned to the voice recording and flight data to determine if a short-lived electrical anomaly allowed the engines to go into reverse while in flight.
We know from the sound analysis, the click that we heard on the CVR is the ground range selector being lifted. Approximately 30 seconds before impact, the captain moves his power levers below flight idle.
Okay, so condition one is met.
The first officer lowers the landing gear 13 seconds later, and they unlock at the exact same time.
Now that the conditions to trigger the glitch have been met, for the next 16 seconds, the levers can be moved to reverse.
The aircraft thinks it's on the ground and it will go into reverse in flight.
And just 3 seconds later, the propellers go into reverse.
That's it.
Ground idle stop off.
They believe that in an effort to lose altitude quickly, the pilots of Flight 9642 unknowingly triggered the electrical anomaly that allowed them to put their engines into reverse. The sequence of events begins with the captain moving the throttles to ground mode to reduce speed and altitude.
Not sure that'll do it. 9642, continuing approach.
The maneuver doesn't have the desired effect. The plane is still too high.
Flaps?
We are flapsed in.
The crew extends the flaps to reduce speed even further. Then,
gear down?
Yeah.
as Captain Pukas keeps his throttles pulled as far back as they can go, the first officer lowers the landing gear, unaware it will trigger the conditions to unlock reverse.
The hell is that?
There will be a loud bang. Overall, everybody will hear that in the cockpit and in the cabin. There will be an immense increase in drag, so you will literally feel your body shifting and shaking.
Captain Pukas doesn't even realize what's happened.
Pull, 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 pull!
Once the landing gear was selected by the first officer, suddenly both engines went into full reverse. It was too late to recover.
25 seconds after the throttle is inadvertently moved to reverse, the plane crashes, resulting in 20 deaths.
If Fokker knew about this anomaly in 1988, why didn't they just fix it?
Investigators examine reports to explain why Flight 9642 was allowed to fly, despite the aircraft manufacturer knowing about a potential glitch.
They said the probability of this happening was so low that no immediate action was required.
It's a very short duration power-up, so therefore the timing has to be very precise, and the likelihood of it happening was low, there's no doubt about it, but certainly it was not zero.
They eventually came up with a modification and issued this service bulletin about it a few years later.
The manufacturer of the skid control unit had issued a service bulletin suggesting a simple fix that would prevent the erroneous signal from being sent.
To modify the anti-skid control unit, to the newer version that would not provide this power-up pulse. One nearly had to add a few diodes and a capacitor, so it wasn't a complicated fix, wasn't difficult to do, it wasn't expensive.
But the notification was issued as a service bulletin, not an airworthiness directive, which would have made the fix mandatory.
If an aircraft manufacturer is making a modification to an aircraft, it gives out a service bulletin. You don't need to do it. An airworthiness directive is a state hazardous to the safety of the operation of the aircraft. That might even ground the whole world fleet of the aircraft till it's modified.
Luxair never performed the suggested 1992 modification to its fleet of Fokker aircraft.
If it had come as an airworthiness directive, they would have complied, no doubt about that, and the problem would have been fixed.
The accident didn't happen here. It happens here, when they accepted an approach they weren't prepared for.
How much fuel will we need?
550. We need 850 when we leave the hold.
No, we need fuel to reach till our alternate plus 20 minutes reserve, so we'll still need 600 kilos.
Yes, but I want to keep...
Luxair 9642, descend to 3,000 feet on 1023, turn left heading 130.
Is that for us?
Yes.
Investigators believe that the main cause of the crash of Flight 9642 was the crew's decision to accept the approach instruction rather than join a holding pattern.
Left heading 130, Luxair 9642. What kind of crap is that?
At the time they got their first heading for the intercept, for the localizer for the runway, they should have said, no, we are not ready for the approach.
Had they simply rejected the approach when the controller gave them those initial headings and descent down to 3,000 feet, the controller would have said, that's fine.
Here, they still don't have the visibility they need to land. They're too high and too fast, and still aren't properly configured. If ever there was a case for a go-around.
9642, continuing approach.
The investigators also fault the crew for not executing a missed approach when they had so much going against them.
Once the crew was surprised by the ATC clearance to start the approach as number 1, a lot of events started, putting the pilots in a kind of a tunnel vision or into a continuation bias, focusing only on the approach and the landing without considering any other options.
To prevent the plane from being put into reverse in the air, the team also recommends that the modification to the skid control box, which stops any erroneous signal, be made mandatory for all Fokker 50 airplanes. Luxair makes the modification to its entire fleet of Fokker aircraft.
The accident, in fact, proves the fact it was that serious and should have been addressed.
Captain Pukas was charged with involuntary manslaughter. He was fined and sentenced to 3.5 years probation.
The lessons we have learned from this tragic Luxair accident is always stick to standard operating procedures, stick to the aircraft's limitations, be aware of operational bulletins. Unfortunately, most of these things were not done by the Luxair crew, and this led to this tragic accident.